hungry for food and products that do better in the world.
We grew what I consider to be just incredible forage because the cycles of nature have restarted.
I think we're transforming that behavior and sometimes helping them redefine their identity as a farmer.
So welcome everybody to the third and final episode of a three-part series on how the world can feed itself nutritious food while still supporting many of these multiple challenges that we need to act upon, from climate change and the loss of animal and plant species to the pollution of river systems and coastal waters, up to ensuring that farmers and rural communities have sustainable lives and livelihoods. The focus of this series, Re-Agriculture, Healthy Food on a Healthy Planet, is showcasing the inspiring world to try and get behind regenerative agriculture. It comes about 4 weeks since the last UN climate conference, COP27, which took place in Egypt. And at this COP27, boosting sustainable agricultural systems and food production were, for the first time, very, very high on the priority list of governments and delegates, which was great. I wanted to mention just one report from Conservation International, the big global NGO that is based in the US, but also the Exponential Roadmap, a science-based initiative that was launched at COP27. And they estimate that the land sector in the world could be transformed from a 12 gigaton source of climate change emissions into a 10 gigaton sink or absorber of carbon pollution. And the study says that the agricultural systems of the world are around 80% of this potential benefit. And the report calls for more support for farmers and ranchers from governments, finance, and the private sector. And the funding would go to boost cover, cropping, reducing tillage, rotating livestock, implementing smart agroforestry projects, for example, such as planting trees along the edges of pasture and harvested areas. And some of the highest benefits thought to come from maintaining and also maintaining good yields can come from changes in currently heavily agriculturally industrialized areas like North America, like Europe, like India and China. There was also a parallel report that just came out called the State of Nature Finance 2022, and that came from the UN Environment Programme, and it underlines that repurposing energy and agricultural subsidies to work with rather than against nature could provide key levels of finance flowing to make all this happen. This third episode will focus on basically two hotspots, Iowa and Georgia, where some farmers and ranchers are scaling regenerative agriculture. And it's not by chance we picked the USA for this third episode, because other recent research indicates that along with Latin America, it's in the USA where not only the biggest opportunities exist, but regenerative agriculture is already scaling, that is already underway in some areas. Let me finally ask our viewers to download the We Don't Have Time app at wedon'thavetime.org, where you can interact with the guests on the show and pose questions to them. I'd also like to thank Unilever for supporting this three-part series. We're delighted to have four terrific guests joining us in just a few. Before that, let me introduce my wonderful co-moderator, HanikaFarber. She's President Nutrition and leads Unilever's Nutrition Business Group. It's a $12 billion business in 150 countries, and it's known for iconic global brands like Knorr and Hellmann's, and Horlicks in India, and Bango soy sauce in Indonesia, and Culver peanut butter. I still have a problem saying that. That's because I've never had it, so maybe I better try it sometime. Above all, she is very passionate about positive systems change in food and agriculture through the lens of regenerative agriculture. Briefly, Hanika, just tell the audience what you're looking forward to on this last episode. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks for having us again. And as long as you eat plenty of Marmite, you can pronounce Calvé any way you would like. So, yeah, what am I looking forward to? I think the previous two episodes have been super inspirational, and it's been great to hear from farmers, especially on how they're putting regenerative agriculture into practice. And that's what I'm really looking forward to today as well. We're going to focus on the US. That doesn't mean Unilever is only doing Regen Ag projects in the US. In fact, we've got about 90 programs either underway or in the pipeline to start soon. And they will take place in more than 50 countries around the world. So, but that said, as you pointed out, the US and Latin America are some of the places where we can make the most difference together. So it'd be great to hear from American farmers today. And again, really excited to hear about action. What are we doing? And maybe getting some advice from these guys as well.
Okay, great. Hanika, thanks very much. Stay with us. Now let's hear from our guests. First up is Sarah Carlson. She's an agronomist with the Practical Farmers of Iowa. Sarah's been at the center of Practical Farmers of Iowa's Cooperators program, where cost sharing assists local farmers further regenerative agriculture via, for example, cover crops. Sarah works with farmers, but also scientists. She works with food companies, and she works with others to make this happen. Sarah has a master's degree on sustainable agriculture from the Iowa State University and has worked on her grandparents' farm in Illinois. Sarah, can you tell us how farmers in Iowa are progressing towards small but also large-scale regenerative agriculture, with perhaps a lens on these switches from industrial to regenerative soybean production? Over to you, Sarah. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having Practical Farmers on your show today. So over the past decade that I've been with Practical Farmers, we've been testing out ways to help corn and soybean farmers add cover crops, a very basic first step practice that they can do to cover up the soil, improve water quality, and also control weeds. But more importantly, start to think about ways to farm corn and soybeans differently. So that's been supported by Unilever and been supported by Pepsi, by a number of supply chain companies. And we were able to, or we are working on, I guess, helping meet farmers where they're at on their journey to either like not even think about regenerative ag, or maybe they've already gone far down that journey, and at least start with an entry point of cover crops. So we have probably 80,000 farmers in the state. They farm 23 million acres of corn and soybeans. It's the dominant, commodities that are grown here. And so to start to wiggle into that system to help break it up a bit and create some inspiration and maybe some curiosity, we've really started with a pretty entry-level practice called cover crops, which is just a plant that covers the ground through the winter time that they can do and not disrupt corn and soybeans too much. And then once we get those farmers in the door and we can start talking to them and helping them connect with other farmers like Wendy Johnson, who will be on here later, then we can help inspire hopefully curiosity and start that treadmill of change and get off the status quo treadmill and get on a different one. Start thinking about small grain production, start thinking about bringing livestock back, start thinking about farming in nature's image, so that, Mother Nature doesn't continue to kind of be mad at us. That's sort of our method of change, I guess, if that makes sense.
What's the kind of feedback you're getting? I mean, is there a good reaction from the farmers who've been involved in this switch, in a sense, to more regenerative agriculture?
So those that I'd say come to PFI and start talking to our agronomists and start engaging with other farmers and remember about how they can neighbor with each other again, how they can cooperate together again to learn together. I think it's revolutionary when they realize oh, this neighbor is actually not my competition. I need to work with that person so together we can be price makers potentially one day in the marketplace as opposed to price takers, which is what we are today. So some folks, I think, get that pretty quickly and then start on that transition. And others, it takes a while to sort of change that behavior of responding constantly to a market signal that says yield at all costs. So I think we're transforming that behavior and sometimes helping them redefine their identity as a farmer. And that's probably the biggest challenge that we have to overcome, because these agronomic changes on the ground are not that hard to do, actually. The bigger change is between our ears and trying to change, lots of bad habits, because the market signal has been strong to grow corn and soybeans at all costs.
Please, Sarah, thank you. Our second guest is also from Iowa. and was past president of the Practical Farmers of Iowa. Wendy Johnson was actually working in the fashion industry in California before returning to her home state of Iowa to work on her family farm. Wendy, it's great to see you. Um, Tell us, what are you farming and what are you up against in the efforts to go regenerative?
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Wendy Johnson. I farm in North Iowa, North Central Iowa to be exact, and I wear a few different hats. So I am uh, uh, a perennial grazing farmer, and I'm also a corn and soybean farmer. So I moved back to Iowa to help manage a 1,200 acre row crop farm, and I learned very quickly that there there needed to be some changes, and so I was attracted to Practical Farmers of Iowa right away, who I feel have been very instrumental in my growth as a regenerative farmer, simply because they provide incentives for farmers like myself to make changes and to observe changes on our farms and use data, and so record our own data. And so I found that very intriguing, and it was a community of farmers, kind of like-minded, who are willing to share um, different ways of doing agriculture. And I found that very refreshing versus the more industrial commodity world. And so when I returned, I learned all that I could of different cropping systems, different things that we could try on our farm. And so we currently use 100% no-till for our corn and soybeans. We've added some small grains into our crop rotations. We have we're starting to reduce our inputs, such as our fertilizer and our herbicides, with the use of cover crops. And all of those things are something that PFI has supported and has really not really pushed an agenda, but allowed farmers to try using incentives. And then we ourselves see the results and can share those results with other farmers. And so I think that's been really a great success. Now, I see the corn and soybean commodity world. It's all around us. It's something that we are deeply ingrained. All the infrastructure is available to us. You know, a corn ethanol plant is only 2 miles down the road from the majority of the land that we steward, and so that's our main market. And we're still living in a corn soybean paradigm, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so what I'm trying to do is transition out of that, and how do we do that has been a little bit difficult because the infrastructure isn't there, because it's just not there. And so we started a farm called Jóia Food and Fiber Farm, and we're a direct-to-consumer business. We raise and sell mostly animal proteins, as well as fiber that comes off of our farm, particularly wool. And we've developed a few different farm businesses that help sell that to consumers. We're trying to engage our customers in a local and regional sense. We aren't shipping nationwide. We do ship nationwide through our fiber business, but for our food, we're really trying to grasp and enhance a more regional food system. And so we have transitioned out of a corn and soybean paradigm and into a perennial one. And so we have added this small number of acres is about 150 to 160 acres. We've transitioned out of tillable corn and soybeans into a perennial agriculture system using livestock, adding trees and shrubs, and adding other types of different crops that can be utilized for food. grown for food. And it's all wonderful. And we're seeing, the nature come back. This is a system where we're working with nature and not against it. But there's a very large difference, between the money economically, what we make on a farm that's as sustainable and full cycle as Jóia Food and Fiber Farm versus the very large predominant commodity farm. And I think there's a lot of, to make some of these leaps, it requires incentives. And so those incentives come in the form of payments, policy, subsidies, different things that are economically incentivizing farmers to make those changes. Now, I kind of went in naively and I changed to a different system because I know that is what is going to help mitigate climate change. But I'm not getting rewarded for any of those things that I'm doing. And I think how do we reward farmers and land stewards like myself that are providing ecosystem services that's not in the large commodity system, but more regionally. And I think that will help move some acres and transition some more acres to a regenerative system. So looking back about 10 years ago, when I first became a board member of PFI, we were at about 1,800 members at that time. And now we are at currently about a little over 6,000 members in a 10-year span. There are, like Sarah had mentioned earlier, 80,000 farmers in Iowa. In 1950, there were 210,000 farmers in Iowa. So we're seeing a lot less farmers, but we're also seeing a jump in membership, meaning farmers are being are interested in regenerative agriculture, and we're seeing that with the PFI membership growth. I also wanted to bring in a statistic. I don't know if it was mentioned, but there are 24.5 million crop acres in Iowa, and only 225,000 of those are in pasture land. And so there's the commodity world, or the industrial agriculture world, has really taken over one of the most altered ecosystems in the world, which is Iowa. And I've always called Iowa kind of ground zero, and we always have to work up from that. We have so much to regenerate.
Good, Wendy, thanks very much. Stay with us. Last but not least, from our farmers, we have Will Harris. He's a livestock farmer, rancher, runs White Oak Pasture Farm in Georgia, USA. Will, from what I understand when we talked before the show, you came into this area of farming systems because you wanted to create a kind of livestock farming system that allowed your animals, in a sense, to live more naturally, where they could behave in ways that match their natural instincts, if I can put it that way. Just tell us a little bit about this moment and where you've gone from here, and how big your farm has become, and what benefits you might be seeing from this in terms of economy, environment, even jobs.
Thank you, Nick. So White Oak Pastures is our family farm. It's my family's owned this land since 1866. I'm the fourth generation. My two daughters and their spouses are the fifth. I've got 7 grandbabies, 5 of which live on the farm. The farm is 3,200 acres here, where we raise cows, hogs, sheep, goats, rabbits, and we butcher them on the farm. Chickens, turkeys, geese, guineas, ducks, and we butcher them in a separate facility on the farm. Organic vegetables, honey, eggs, a number of other little ancillary businesses. The and the change has been dramatic in every sense of the word. Animal welfare is what drew me to it. It was a canary in the coal mine for me about 25 years ago. I quickly embraced the land management side, and unintentionally, the community benefited. Today, we've got 180 employees. We're the largest private employer in the county. Payroll is over $100,000 a week in the poorest county in Georgia. So the economic impact has been great, but was unintentional. That was not the goal. The goal was animals and land.
Interesting. And do you see environmental impacts? I know you've done some work and some studies there on how much carbon you're actually banging into the land, which sounded very impressive.
The environmental impact is incredible. There's a study on our website, an LCA life cycle assessment. On our website is whiteoakpastures.com under the environmental stewardship side. And it shows over a 20-year period, we moved the organic matter in our land from about 0.5% to over 5%, which is, I think it's just an incredible, I'm not a climate change specialist. I can't address all that, but from a productivity perspective, it's just been incredible. We don't use any chemical fertilizer, any pesticides, any tillage, but we grew what I consider to be just incredible forage because the cycles of nature have restarted.
Yeah. Super. Okay, stay with us, Will. Let's just maybe go now to Hanika again a little bit. Hanika, what do you make about what you've heard so far? I mean, it was fascinating to hear from Will that in one of the poorest counties in Georgia, that his employment than it had been, and others seeing benefits as well in these two interesting states in the USA.
No, it's fantastic work. I'm super impressed. And at Unilever, we've had the pleasure of working with the practical farmers of Iowa, and with Sarah. And Sarah is so right when she says, it's not just about the practices that you want to implement, like cover cropping or no-till, but it's about changing a culture. And of course, farmers aren't going to listen to Unilever or PepsiCo when it comes to culture and how they farm. So the partnerships with farmer organizations are absolutely critical because they're going to listen to Sarah or to the farmer next door much more than big corporations. So we really appreciate the collaboration with PFI, and it was wonderful to hear from Sarah how PFI has grown over the years. And we're always looking for, more partnerships like that in areas where we grow a lot of stuff. But certainly soybeans in Iowa are absolutely critical for us. And I'm pretty excited to say that thanks to the partnership and the farmers of Iowa, now 50% of the Hellmann's mayonnaise in the United States is made with regeneratively farmed soybeans. And that's so important. Of course, we want to take that to 100%. So, and then I love what Will said about actual measurement and the LCAs, because we can do all this, but if we don't know the impact that it has, then it's, a little bit of charity or just feel good work. So I love, Will, that that you actually know the impact it's made. And maybe that's one follow-up question I had for Sarah. Sarah, as all the farmers that you work with, how are you guys approaching measurement, reporting, validation of data to make sure that the practices are really working?
Yes. So for our cost share programs where we're using company money to invest in farmers to offset some of that cost, some of that risk to do those practices, we have farmers do surveys at the end of the cropping season to tell us, one, what they liked about the practices, things they want to try next year that are different, if they want to get involved in research. And then we have them share with us various verification methods. So mostly it's through seed receipts so that we can see, okay, they're purchasing cereal rye, for example, and they're using that as their cover crop. And so we have a receipt for verification. But more importantly, on that receipt, we see the costs of the cereal rye. And so then from, 1,200 receipts this year that we'll collect from farmers in our programs, we can then return that information to farmers in aggregate and say, okay, cost of cover crop seed was this distribution across the 1,200 of you. Those that spent a lot more on seed might consider growing your own seed next year so that you can bring down that expense. And then that helps get a demand for small grains in rotation, like what Wendy was talking about, because we don't have a strong small grain market signal. We make a lot more things out of corn than we do out of oats today, even though oat milk is all the craze. We don't really consume that many oats, and we need a stronger small grain demand so we can break up that corn soybean system. So through that verification of the receipts, we're able to then share that data back. Then as far as like collecting soil data, like what Will's doing intensively on their farm, I'm guessing with a third party, unless Will, you're collecting all that and then analyzing it in your own lab. We've done those studies, and we use peer-reviewed literature to say, okay, if cover crops grow to these heights, they're planted at these dates, at these seeding rates, we will estimate, a 30 to 60% improvement in soil organic matter over time. Now, to be fair, we're already starting with 3 to 4% organic matter soils in central Iowa. So going from 0.5% to 5%, we're not going to go from 3% to 10% in Iowa, which would be that potential increase, unless we go back to prairie. So if we get really serious about this and start grazing prairie, then we can get up to 10% organic matter soils, which is what was here when we broke it out 100 years ago. And that's the interest that we're living on. With still growing corn and soybeans high yield, but every year that is decreasing. So we have taken a position of not doing a ton of soil sampling every year, and we help farmers basically focus on getting the practice in the ground and helping them use that practice in their agronomic management system for weed control, and growing a lot of rye or a lot of cover crop to use for weed control, and then assuming that the height of rye marries up with the research that's already been published by peer-reviewed, land-grant universities. So that's been our position on doing a lot of data collection. If we need to do small, trials, then we do that. But to scale this thing, we can't be doing soil sampling on every field every year. And the signal response is like over a 10-year period. So we want to use rye or other regen practices as part of the agronomic toolkit, and have it be thought of more as an agronomic decision tool and not as much as a conservation tool. And so that's why we still message the benefits of environmental stewardship from cover crops, but we really message it more as like part of growing corn and soybeans, the right way to growing corn and soybeans.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, Hanika, thanks. Let's turn to Ethan Soloviev. Viev or Viev?
Soloviev.
I'm really mumbling that one. Okay, say it again. Brilliant. Okay. You actually farm regeneratively on a farm in New York State, I understand, but you're with us in your capacity of the company HowGood, which analyzes trends in the sustainability of thousands of food products. And what I wanted to ask you was, can you perhaps help the audience understand how regenerative agriculture is actually developing and where? Because we both discussed that Financial Times article recently. It said 15% of the world's lands are broadly regenerative. You weren't so sure, you thought that maybe a bit on a high number. But it did suggest that North America and Latin America are kind of out in front in terms of growing and scaling this. So give us your global perspective and bring in USA. How does it fit in all this?
Regenerative agriculture is the fastest growing environmental movement in the world. It is outpacing anything else, and I can tell you why. All the previous approaches to sustainability, whether agricultural, environmental, they were all about doing less harm. They're about, how do we reduce the impact of this practice or reduce the amount of plastic in this water bottle? And that at a very intuitive level just didn't connect with people, from consumers to decision makers at the tops of companies, NGOs, farmers around the world. Doing less harm just didn't feel that good. When you get to regeneration, you're actually adding value. You're enhancing the quality of the biodiversity, the water, the economic livelihoods, the creativity of farmers and producers around the world. Regeneration feels good. People want regeneration. They want to add to something, not do a little less bad. And so in every continent in the world, minus Antarctica, we see regenerative agriculture growing. We've been tracking it over the last 15 years. Actually, we're about to release a new map that shows the growth of regenerative agriculture. It's up 75% just in the last year in terms of people using the term. And I think another big part of it is that business is leading. As opposed to, say, the organic movement, which has done incredible things for ecosystems and people around the world, which is a very bottoms-up movement, there's this thing happening now where everybody in the world sees the importance of nature and agriculture as a solution. I just got back from COP27 in Egypt. I'm here now at COP15, the biodiversity COP in Montreal. And there's this excitement, there's this realization, 30% of climate impacts come from agriculture, but of all the different sectors out there, agriculture is the only one that can add value, that can capture carbon, that can go against it. And at the same time, we can enhance biodiversity and increase farmer and producer livelihoods around the world. So business is saying, wait, this is a good idea. This is a win-win-win. We should get behind this. And so there's now hundreds of billions in revenue of companies around the world coming together in different coalitions, from One Planet Business to Biodiversity Coalition to the Sustainable Markets Initiative, who are saying, let's pool our forces, let's do our thinking, and let's push regenerative agriculture forward in the world for the farmers, but then also for the indigenous people who many would say were the original practicers of regenerative agriculture everywhere in the world. And so can we support simultaneously biodiversity, human health, nutrition, soil health, all at one time through investing in regenerative agriculture? The word I'm getting, and I can say a little bit more on the consumer side, the word I'm getting is, yes, we can do this, and let's do it fast.
Ethan, tell us, is it right that the USA and Latin America are currently, carrying the flag, or have been carrying the flag a little faster than, say, other parts of the world? Or not?
I think you see large arable landmass where there are some, as Sarah was saying, there are some straightforward things that you can learn to do that don't require huge investments, that don't require that much new equipment, that you can make a small shift in how a farmer is thinking, or the farmer can make that shift, and it will immediately affect large areas of land. That's true across much of the United States and in larger parts of South America, especially. So I think you do see a lot of motion there. Also, many of the sort of creators, progenitors, proponents of regenerative agriculture have been building community in South America, Latin America, and the United States, and Canada as well, for many years. And so I think there's that, both Will and Sarah have spoken to this idea of community, of peer-to-peer learning. And I think that there's enough of a critical mass of farmers who have made some huge progress, who are decreasing their costs, increasing their profitability through regenerative agriculture, that it's really taking off. And in a way, you see something very similar on the consumer side. If you look at consumers are hungry for food and products that do better in the world. And the folks who have tracked this are seeing that regenerative and sustainably marketed products are speeding up and are growing much faster than other categories. NYU and IRI and the Center for Sustainable Business, they showed recently in their ongoing reporting that sustainably marketed products outgrew their categories by anywhere from 3 to 7%. Nielsen IQ on the other side is also looking at this data, and they're not looking at they're not looking at intent data or marketing data. They're looking at hard purchases, what has been sold. And they're also seeing a growth of anywhere from 20 to 60% in the sales of products that are marketed in this way, because consumers want it.
Okay. All right, stay with us on this, and I'm going to bring back Hanika in a brief moment, but I just wanted to go back to Will. Now we're in the second half here. We're going to try and dig in a bit deeper here. Will, can you perhaps tell us from your perspective, again, we talked about this before, there is a general gearing, an economic gearing, maybe it's the incentives that governments provide or others provide, that seem to be still working against regenerative agriculture. It could be agricultural subsidies, just the wrong subsidies really, that don't work for regenerative agriculture. And And then tell me a little bit, because you were very concerned when we talked about the food companies themselves. You weren't really convinced that the food companies really that they're pushing profits and maybe mass production rather than thinking about the externalities that come from intensive agriculture. Give us your where do you feel about this area? The economics, are they geared against it? And are the food companies really good players to be with in this transformation?
So I don't believe that meaningful change will come to food production through farm policy. I've been around a long time, and I'm pretty sure that won't happen. And the reason is because the foreign policy is so written by uh, uh, politicians who are fed, well, actually, in many cases, it's actually written by lobbyists and submitted to politicians. And I don't think we'll ever see meaningful change come from policy. I think meaningful change may come from, if it comes, will come through consumers. Uh, big ag and big food are, I don't consider them to be evil empires, but they have grown to be uh, incredibly powerful economic and political machines over the last 75 or 80 years by bringing the factory model, the industrial factory model, and commoditization and centralization to food production and supply. And it has been incredibly efficient, incredibly successful. It's very linear, so it's very scalable, and just takes incredible cost out of food production. And keep in mind that over this last 80 or whatever years, all of the focus has been on efficiency at all cost. And the cost have fell on the backs of the land, the water, the environment, the animals, and the economics of rural America. So and again, and those companies for the most part are stock companies, publicly traded companies. So those executives running those companies are doing what they have a responsibility to do, which is take cost out of production for the benefit of the profit of the shareholder. In so many instances, the cost wasn't taken out; the cost was externalized. So it's a really damaging system that we have. There's a lot of species extinction, a lot of diminished resources, a lot of pollution, a lot of. I don't usually talk about health issues because that's not. But there are a lot of people that do consider the health cost as part of this industrialization, commoditization, centralization. So when you take a publicly traded company who has been incredibly successful by making things linear and efficiency that maybe weren't meant to be linear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sarah, does that chime with your experience? I mean, is government policy and the system as it exists in our world still geared against rapid scaling of regenerative agriculture? Maybe I can put it that way. We're clearly seeing it happening, and as Ethan said, it's growing very fast, but in comparison to what? In other words, the other side of the story, which is we still have a world that's still very dominated by very intensive production systems. What do you make of that?
Yeah, boy, Will just really knocked it out of the park on explaining it. And I would just add to the big food, big ad nexus, big carbon. So like when we hear about all this money and all these potential earnings going into the sale of carbon and all the tech companies that want to get in on that, that then is squandering money from the practitioners that need to implement these practices, which is the problem that we have gotten ourselves in, which is what Will explained. So We've externalized those costs on the backs of farmers and the environment, and we haven't internalized them. So, like, one of our core messages to supply chain companies when we work with them, like Unilever, is procurement has to procure differently. We can't continue to buy corn and soybeans the way we do today. So, like, we've seen from the US government, just one shout out to a potential policy change, although I am aligned with Will on like the struggles, is, if we need 20,000 widgets, it's easier for a company to get 20,000 widgets from one company, from one supplier, as opposed to going to 20 suppliers that supply smaller numbers of widgets. Now, with factories, it's not as big of a deal, but with Mother Nature, with agriculture, Mother Nature doesn't like this many pigs in one spot. Mother Nature doesn't like this many soybeans in one spot. And so she is actively telling us, get with the program, procurement. And so supply chains are really going to have to figure out how to procure differently and help support a lot more smaller producers, because that's actually what Mother Nature wants. And so I worry a little bit about regen ag, jumping on big ag, big food, jumping on with big carbon, because there's a lot of money to be made, and we're not going to fix any of this. And so if we don't really change the way we procure and support mid and small sized businesses that can steward the land and have more people per acre, we're not going to actually scale this thing at all. And Mother Nature's just going to bite us in the butt continually.
So, Hanika, you're in the hot seat now because you've heard from Will and Sarah. I mean, maybe the question, Hanika, is why does Unilever actually care and support farmers to switch to regenerative agriculture? Why is it in your, I suppose you say, your business interests to do this? And how do you respond to Will, who is, a bit skeptical about the role and the motives of the food company?
No, and he's right to be skeptical, because for many years I would completely agree with you, Will. You said 75 years, maybe even more. Big food and big ag did treat farming like a factory. Unilever, maybe a little earlier than some others, did wake up to the fact that that is not a model that's going to serve us well for another 75 or 100 years. So as a company, we're almost 100 years old. We'd like to live on and thrive for another 100 years. And it became very clear to us in the last decade that the way we procure, indeed, Sarah, as you say, wasn't right. It wasn't going to serve us well for the next 100 years. And that's come to life in many ways. But I'll give you one example, which is just of the last year. We're the biggest seller of mustard in Europe with a brand called My. Last year, we had no mustard because climate change made crops fail in France, where we procure, in Canada, where we procure, and our backup plan was the Ukraine. And we all know how that worked out. So we had no mustard, which again brought home to us that if we don't start farming in different ways that are more climate resistant, that are better for the soil, that emit less, we don't have a business model. And we did many of the wrong things for many, many years, but we're trying to get it right in the last decade. So since 2010, we've actually enabled more than 800,000 farmers to switch to what we initially called our Sustainable Agriculture Code. We now call it, it's a different code, the Regenerative Agriculture Code. And our model is implement with partners. So we work with the Practical Farmers of Iowa, but also many others, like the Coalition for Natural Farming in India, which is a very big market for us as well, and various other farmer organizations around the world. We fund, because again, this takes money, especially in the transition. Those first 3 to 5 years, this costs money to do those regenerative practices. And we do that through procurement. We have a number of funds, including a €1 billion climate and nature fund, which funds some of these programs. And then we also do advocate and communicate. We advocate with governments to make sure those policies, and yeah, you can call it lobbying, but I hope that we're lobbying in the right direction. And you guys tell us if we do, but we can't continue for governments to subsidize practices that actually are destroying the planet versus helping the planet. So we're trying to work that with government. And then, Will, as you said as well, in the end, it will come down to the consumers. So we have to figure out ways in which we tell the regenerative agriculture story to the consumer. So we're working on that. So I don't think we have the golden nugget just yet on that. We'll take any advice from y'all, but I think Unilever certainly has realized that we can't continue the way we farmed for 75 years if we want to be resilient for many years to come. And I'm delighted to say that many of our frenemies in big food have come to the same conclusion. And Ethan, I think that's what you were talking about earlier. It's the talk of the town. So now we need to deliver on it all together. And we'll do that through procurement and through putting our money where our mouth is.
Well, what we'll do, Will, is we'll get Hanika back on a show just like this in, say, 2 years, and then we can ask her definitively what they've done in those last 2 years. Would that make sense?
It does. I just see it as being extremely difficult. These big food, big ag has been so incredibly successful doing what it set out to do. None of that was evil. There was a demand for cheap, abundant, safe food. Mm-hmm. And that's what people talked about from World War II fall. Mm-hmm. And it was incredibly successful. It's incredibly successful delivering cheap, I'd say obscenely cheap, and safe, I'd say abundant, wastefully abundant, and safe in the short-term sense, food. It was just incredible success. Mm-hmm. And for any monolithic company to suddenly go back on the three basic tenets that made you successful, industrialization, centralization, commoditization, is so hard. I mean, how big is a Hellman's mayonnaise factory? I mean, I've never seen one, but I bet it's big. I bet it takes a lot of soybeans to run it.
1 million eggs a day.
And eggs. And you know what commoditization means to me is there was a time when all farmers were incentivized to put the most value they could in their crop. Because if I had the reputation of being the best tomato grower or egg producer or pig producer in my market, my county, my state, I got a premium for it. And then we needed these huge volumes to run these monolithic plants, so we commoditized and we set a minimum standard. And suddenly, instead of trying to make my product the best it could be, I was financially incentivized to just meet the minimum standard. So it was a race to the bottom. Yeah. And people who continued to produce premium products went out of business. Mm-hmm. Unless you created your own market.
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly the dynamic that we're trying to recreate, including on soybeans and in Iowa, Sarah. I mean, you mentioned it, how do we make the market anew?
Mm-hmm. So let's just, that's a very interesting debate. And I think it's something that we all have to wait and see how it all ends up. But I mean, I certainly think I'm aware from another perspective that a company like Unilever, for example, has made so many promises and pledges to do certain things, from climate change to other things, that they are being so well scrutinized by many of the big NGOs as well to meet those targets, as well as governments. So I hope that those governments, those NGOs, hold companies accountable to what they promised to do. And let's see. I think we have to wait and see on this. But I think, Hanika, that was good faith of you to answer that question, and perfectly reasonable of you, Will, to pose those points. So thank you very much indeed, both of you. Ethan, I want to come back to you. You mentioned a little bit about how it's going globally. Do you think there's enough pressures on governments and companies to actually do the right thing? How do we ensure accountability from your perspective? Is it only the consumer, or are there other people that need to hold this journey accountable?
The key thing that holds it all together, that has to hold it all together, the glue or the cement, has to be data. It has to be one unified, harmonized system of data with transparency to it that connects individual farms to large and small food producing companies all the way to the consumer. So this end-to-end understanding and visibility of the data. Then if we can agree on common outcomes, not necessarily just practices are great, but common outcomes like enhanced carbon in the soil, like increased biodiversity, like living wages for farmers and producer communities around the world. If we can be tracking those outcomes and seeing how are they actually happening, then it's very hard to greenwash. If you have that data transparency, it's hard for a company to say something and do something else when that data is visible. HowGood has built a database for the last 15 years that helps to see that end-to-end visibility right to individual farms all the way through the system and out to consumers. And consumers want it. Consumers want eco labels on their food. They want a carbon footprint. They say carbon is the new calorie. Unilever's made actually a great commitment that says we're going to carbon label 70,000 products. I think other companies will follow suit. I think retailers are following suit. 85% of the top United States and European retailers use some form of sustainability attribute like a carbon label or an eco label or a little badge that says climate friendly in their online communications. So I think that the pressure should come from consumers. I think it'd be great if the pressure came from government. However, like Will said, I'm not going to wait around for it. And one of the things that's exciting about these global conference of the parties, whether climate or biodiversity, is that, yes, the governments are moving towards agreements on how they move things forward, but more exciting is this swell of business and civil society activity around them that is saying, yes, good, go forward, bold, ambitious targets, accountability, but also we're not going to wait. We don't have time. We've got to push forward and make the case, make the action on the business, on the individual farmer, on the individual enterprise, small, large, medium, to move this forward. So I think there's hope. Like Will said, it's going to be hard, but I definitely see a great potential in the forces that are coming together today.
Hanika, I think this is the moment to ask this question, because you kind of half raised it before, which is, how the devil do we tell consumers that this is from regenerative farming systems, right? I mean, Ethan was chomping at the bit to respond to that, but I think it'd be nice to ask Wendy, for example, and Sarah and Will, how do the people know that you are doing things regeneratively? How do they find out? Is there a way of telling the market and the consumers? I mean, Hanika, because this is important, isn't it?
No, absolutely. It is important. And I'd love to take some input here from the farmers on the call. What would you like to see? We certainly haven't found the silver bullet. Will, go ahead. Yeah.
So nobody wants to hear this because nobody really has the bandwidth to deal with it. But I think that consumers have to know their farmer, at least through social media. You know, the USDA food labeling laws suck real bad. You know, the best example I know of it, although there are many, is I compete with beef, grass-fed beef marked product of the USA, where the animal was born, raised, and slaughtered in Uruguay, Australia, and New Zealand. But when it's in the grocery store, it says product of the USA, and it's legal. It's fraudulent, but it's legal. So I don't think that labeling, for the same reasons, for the big food doesn't want strong labeling laws. Similarly, certifications have been a horrible disappointment to me. I really was a great advocate of certifications for many years. We were the first to be certified by a number of different certifiers. I thought I was like merit badges in a Boy Scout. You know, I wanted to have as many as I could. But there have been so many, and some of them are such low-hanging fruit that the consumer is horribly confused. So it has a negative effect. They're confused and say, oh, hell, they're all labeled. It's fine. This one's fine. And the one they say is fine is probably the cheapest one because it was a very low-hanging fruit label. So I can go on and on about what doesn't work. And what does work is knowing your farmer. And that's hard. Nobody's got the bandwidth for that. But if you really want to know what you're buying and eating, it's what you got to do.
Yeah. Well, that's great advice. And I will take that on board because I think you're onto something. And how we do that is tricky, but it's not impossible. I like it. Sarah, any thoughts from you on that?
Well, I think shortening the supply chain, which is what Will's saying, also helps us get around the big data suggestion from Ethan. So, Ethan, I think, in a world where we continue with commodities and we have consumers very far from their producers, then we probably need a lot of data, which I think gets us into a lot of data surveillance and the opportunity for people to potentially make money off of data. So I get a little nervous when we go big data versus the hard work of shortening the supply chain, which is what Wendy and Will are doing today, and supporting them, in getting out of a system where they're selling it into a vacuum and who knows where those soybeans go, versus like that animal walking, to the slaughterhouse on farm, and then they know where those pork chops went. So, it's almost like we're really creating different food systems. And one food system is people that are willing to know the farmer and have the means to take the time to do that. And the other middle food system is this commodity system, that really rides along with the energy system. I mean, the energy and food commodity system are kind of this whole other beast. And so I think in Unilever's position and in food companies' positions, companies that are food primarily and aren't in the food and energy space, I think you can align yourselves more with this shortened supply chain, with supporting farmers that are actually delivering goods directly to consumers in a shortened supply chain, and align yourselves more on that type of food supply production system than against with energy, which is that, there's food systems that align a lot with energy production, and there's food systems that can align with food production and a shortened supply chain. So I think that's something in the next 10 years that's got to be teased out.
I love it, Sarah. And I think in a way, we do know, if I just take Hellman's America as an example, which is not small business, we do know which farmers grow the soybeans for Hellman's, actually. So
I know 900 of your soybean farmers.
So it's I love it. We'll take that on board.
Wendy,
did you have any other thoughts on the consumer?
Well, the biggest thing is the big will get bigger. So if there'll be less of us, less farmers, I think that would be a detriment to the world and for food security. The food will not be as nutritious. We will have major ecological harm if that were to happen. And the land that we so depend on for food and energy currently will degrade insurmountably. And so we need to take action. And I think the urgency is there. We need much broader and bigger emphasis and movement, incentives, policy change toward and companies, food companies like Unilever, making these kind of pushes from another side of the agricultural food system. I did want to point out, that Iowa land, the property value of land is based on something called a CSR, or a corn suitability rating. And so farmers like myself who are trying to do something different, who are trying to provide ecological balance, and we're trying to sequester more carbon, we're trying to put more perennials on the land. It's a very difficult way to pay our property taxes, for example, because we don't have a CSR rating. And that is something that I think is not helping us when we're always thinking about corn and our land values are based on corn. That, I think that in itself needs to change to be able to make some of the other changes that are urgently needed to help mitigate climate change in the agricultural sector.
Good. Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've actually, we've been just gone over time, which is absolutely fine. This, as we all know, is no end to this story. This is a series where, we're trying to inform an audience of a very eclectic audience out there of different people who are generally passionate about the environment, generally passionate about climate change action, but also are, aware that agriculture is an important part of this story. And I think that you've all contributed greatly to again furthering this understanding of what we're all trying to do. We will have to see where this goes from here for sure. But I think the whole world is really, really, really looking now at regenerative agriculture in a way that perhaps hadn't been looked at before. And it seems that a bubble somewhere has burst. I mean, Ethan backed it up. Hanika speaking a bit about Unilever's vision, but also just having you three amazing people from Iowa and Georgia is living proof that there actually is action happening out there. It's not going to be easy. The system probably is geared against it right now, although clearly there is some form of momentum happening which could actually override that default system which has powered up agriculture and energy and so much of our own lives for far too long. Hanika, any last thoughts that you want to share before we say arrivederci?
No, thanks so much to all of you. You are out there on the front line of farming. We have to learn from you, and we so appreciate you every day. Thank you.
Great. So thanks indeed to the terrific guests for being with us. Thank you very much. And hope to see you again somewhere on a We Don't Have Time show talking about these big topics. Thank you very much indeed.
Bye.